Hey, what's going on, everybody? Bit vs. Andy here, and today we're going to be covering what are elements, what is elemental damage, and what are elemental resistances, and basically everything that has to do with the elements in Bit Heroes. So, starting at Zone 10, and the wiki says it here, elemental damage, gear, and familiars will start to show up in the game. Now, there is only a handful of ways that we can see elements in the game. There's elemental resist, there's bonus elemental damage, or just straight up elemental damage. And there's also special effects, such as shock, combustion, bleed, freeze. Basically, shock will do electric damage, combust will do fire, bleed, funny enough, does air, and freeze does water. So that's the way you can see elements in the game. Now, what are the elemental types? We can see here on the wiki. Shout out to the Bit Heroes wiki, link to this page in the description below. But we can see that there's fire, earth, air, electric, water, and the neutral physical. And each of them is weak to one other element and strong towards another, except physical is neutral to all other elements. As well as if it's weak to one, strong to the other, neutral to the rest. So, it says here fire is weak to water, strong against earth. And you can see this circle showing, water beats fire, beats earth, beats air, beats electric, beats water, and physical in the middle. Pretty nice graphic, actually. Now, what this means is not like Pokemon. A water skill is not going to deal double damage to a fire familiar, and it's not going to deal half damage to an electric familiar. How this works is rooted in the resistances. Damage reduction and elemental resistances are one and the same here. Just consider damage reduction, physical damage resistance. Now I'll make this a lot clearer. What this does, and you can sort of read it here, I think it's a little bit confusing, but so it's not the attack that is super effective or not very effective against the enemies. It's your resistances. So think fire resistance, water resistance, as well as just standard damage reduction. We can think as physical resistance, okay? And I want you to think of it like that. So we saw earlier the fire is weak to water and strong to earth. What that means is fire, the element that it's weak towards, if we have 10% fire resistance, water is going to cut right through that resistance, and it's going to stop 0% of the water damage coming in. If we have 10% fire resistance and fire damage comes at us, we'll stop the full 10% fire damage. It will do 100% of the damage resistance to that element. If earth comes in and we have 10% fire resistance, it's only going to stop 75% of that, so 7.5% of the damage from that earth attack will be resisted. Now, we saw that fire was good against earth. If you have, earth resistance, fire is going to be unaffected by that earth resistance. And so you can see down the line, if you have air resistance and you're hit by earth, it's not going to stop anything. If you have electric resistance and you're hit by air, it's not going to stop anything. If you have water resistance and it's hit by electric, it's not going to stop anything. Now, this is super important to know because even if you have a fire resistance, I first thought that that's only good against fire, but it's still 75% effective against physical, earth, air, and electric. So, that's 4 out of the 5 elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's 5 out of the 6. That's 5 out of the 6 types of damage that can hit me that it's helpful against, okay? But it's most helpful against fire, and it's not at all helpful against water. Now, this is also important to note that physical resistance, or straight up, it's called damage reduction, is notably and probably considered the very best because it has no weakness and is strong against physical and 75% effective towards the rest. So you can start thinking of resistances as damage reduction that has benefits and that has pros and cons versus other elements. Now, let's say we have a little bit of physical damage reduction and we have fire resistance. Let's say we have 10% of each and we get hit by a fire attack. The physical 10% is going to be 7.5% damage reduction, and the fire 10% is going to be the full 10%. So if they hit us for 100, we'll stop 17.5 of that damage. Now with that same example where we have 10% physical and 10% fire damage, if we get hit by a water attack, the physical will stop 7.5. The physical 10% damage reduction will stop 7.5 water damage, and the 10% fire damage will stop 0 of that water damage, leaving us with 7.5. So based on the opponent you are facing, it is always, of course, best, if you're facing a water opponent, get as much water resistance as you can for that 1-to-1 resistance to actual damage blocked. But it can't always be possible. The most consistent is physical. It has no weaknesses. There's no zeros across the board here. But it can be more common in certain gear to give you, 5% fire resist here and there. And I don't want you to think that that is doing you no good because you're not facing a fire opponent. No, it's doing you 0.75 good against most opponents. Now, if I scroll down a little bit further, it does show a couple of formulas here. If you do want to get into the nitty gritty, this is kind of what I was explaining. Damage reduction 1 times its efficiency. So I was saying, where the physical has 1, it would be 10% physical times its 100%, and so on. So here you can do the math on your damage resistances. And then one really important thing for you to know with damage resistance and damage reduction, and elemental resistances, is that you can never pass 75% damage reduction. So let's just say I had 50% physical damage reduction and 50% fire resistance, and I was hit by an air attack. 75% of 50 is 37.5, which would mean, I'm getting 37.5 damage reduction here, 37.5 damage reduction here, equaling 75. But if it was a physical or a fire attack where one of those was a 100% efficiency, where one of those resistances was at 100% efficiency, there would be a 50 plus a 37.5, which would equal 87.5, but would only block 75%. Because if total damage reduction is greater than 75, then it just equals 75. So what that means is if you want to maximize your build, you want to find a column where you're getting to that 75 as often as you can. Now, hitting 75% physical damage reduction is you'd have to dedicate a lot of your gear towards that physical damage reduction. And 5 out of the 6 types of enemies, that's getting cut into 3/4. So maybe if you're facing a certain raid or world boss where they deal water damage, earth damage, whatever, you can sneak in some of that resistances to help get you closer to that max 75%. Now, just scrolling down to some of the commonly asked questions that they have in the wiki here. What is the maximum resistance? We covered that, 75% cap. This asks, can elemental damage be triggered by pets, deflects, and redirects? Yes. So be careful if you're sending out fire damage and you get deflected. Make sure you might want to make sure you have some fire resistance. Now, certain familiars and fusions come with elemental damage and reductions. And then super important here, if you want to check out how your build is doing on these and maybe do some of the math on your own hero, it asks, how can I view my elemental damage and reduction? You can find it in the stats section in your player info, and it has a nice graphic here where you can see, fire damage, resistance, electric, blah, 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 and so on. So that's how the elements work in Bit Heroes. I know I was confused on this for a long time, thinking it was like Pokemon, where I was like, gosh, I'm bringing water damage to a fire, or I'm bringing fire damage to a water fight. I'm going to be terrible. But unless that water opponent that I'm facing has fire resistance, I'm totally fine. So really, if you're a tank, where it becomes an issue is where you're weak. If you stack 75% fire damage and you are doing, really good against 5 out of the 6 elemental types, but you come up against a water opponent and he is just smacking you, this might be why. Because he's hitting you with water damage and your fire resistance is doing nothing. So definitely something to consider when you're planning your builds is who you are facing, what elemental damage are they going to be dealing with you, do you have a way to get that specific resistance up? If they're dealing normal damage, it's just physical, grab physical damage reduction. If it's fire damage, try to get as much fire as you can, or at least just avoid water resistance. So I hope this was helpful. I know I had a lot of questions and I was very confused for a long time on elemental damage. So please do not be afraid to ask questions in the comments. I will get back to as many of you with questions as I possibly can. And that's going to be all for this one, folks. I hope this helped you learn about elements. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Consider liking and subscribing. Consider checking out my live streams every Saturday night around 6 p.m. US Central Time on Twitch and on YouTube. And until next time, good luck with your grind, everybody. Take care.